Part 1. The opening, a matter of life and death. Imagine it's the year 1250, in a tiny village outside Bergen, Norway. The sun hasn't appeared for weeks. The temperature has plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and snow presses against your wooden home almost to the roofline. There is no electricity, no gas, no backup heat. In this world, firewood is not comfort, it is survival. For medieval families, the hearth was the heart of the home. It gave light, warmth, and the only way to cook food. But it also held a constant threat. If your firewood failed, so did you. One smoky log on a freezing night could mean illness, frostbite, or worse. What's surprising is that today, despite having moisture meters, weather apps, and modern tools, many of us still can't keep a clean fire going. We throw a log into the stove, and instead of a warm roar, we get steam, smoke, and disappointment. So what did medieval farmers understand that we've forgotten? How did they dry wood perfectly for 8 long months in some of the coldest, dampest climates on Earth, without plastic tarps, without kilns, without modern engineering? They knew a science of wood, air, and heat that we barely recognize today. And in this episode, we're going to uncover that forgotten thermodynamics, the same knowledge that once kept entire villages alive through brutal winters, and might just help us cut our modern energy bills too. Welcome to the forgotten science of firewood storage that kept medieval families alive. Let's begin. Part 2. The modern sizzle. Why your wood is wet. Now let's step out of the medieval longhouse and into your backyard. Picture this familiar scene. You cut your firewood in the spring, stack it neatly, pull a heavy plastic tarp over the top, and walk away feeling proud of a job well done. But 8 months later, when winter finally bites, you toss a log onto the fire, and instead of that satisfying roar of flame, you hear a weak hiss. The log sweats, the stove smokes, and the room fills with frustration instead of warmth. This isn't bad luck. It's modern thermodynamics failing right in your hands. The truth is that most firewood today is stored in ways medieval farmers would have never trusted. Wood is hygroscopic, a living sponge long after the tree has died. It absorbs moisture not just from rain, but from dew, from the ground, and even from humid air. And once wet, it holds that moisture far longer than we expect. Modern studies confirm it. Firewood left in open air, even covered on top, often sits at 25 to 30% moisture after an entire year. That might not sound dramatic, but thermodynamically, it's a disaster. To burn cleanly and efficiently, wood needs to be under 20%. Above that, the fire spends most of its energy boiling water instead of generating heat. Every single kilogram of water hidden inside your log steals more than 2 megajoules of energy just to turn into steam. So instead of heating your home, you're vaporizing your time, fuel, and money. But the consequences don't end there. Wet wood creates creosote, the dark, sticky residue that clings to the inside of chimneys when fires burn too cool. Over time, that buildup becomes the silent villain of winter. One spark, one hot ember, and creosote can ignite like gasoline, racing up the flue and swallowing an entire home in minutes. Medieval families understood this danger intimately. For them, a chimney fire was not an inconvenience or a repair bill, it was a life and death catastrophe. And so they didn't gamble with their fuel. They didn't tolerate green logs or soggy stacks. They designed their villages, their sheds, and even their homes around one core principle. Dry wood means survival. Wet wood means danger. And in the next chapter, we'll uncover how they used walls, wind, and a bit of brilliant physics to keep their fuel bone dry through rain, through snow, and through some of the harshest winters ever recorded. Part 3. The attached shed, the first thermodynamic trick. To understand how medieval families kept their firewood perfectly dry, you have to look closely at the archaeological traces they left behind. Across medieval Germany, Switzerland, and the frozen north of Scandinavia, one pattern appears again and again. They almost never stored their wood in a lonely shed standing out in the yard. Instead, they built what historians now call house barn structures, where the firewood lived directly against the walls of the home itself. At first glance, it seems inconvenient, but in reality, it was a quiet masterpiece of climate engineering. The first advantage was something medieval builders understood instinctively: the thermal leak. Even the simplest cottage, with gaps between its timbers and crude insulation, still released a steady trickle of warmth through its walls. Not enough to heat a yard, but enough to create a narrow band of air, just 3 to 5 degrees warmer than the freezing world outside. That tiny temperature boost kept nighttime condensation from settling on the logs, and it encouraged a slow, constant airflow that carried moisture away rather than trapping it in. And then came their second insight, an understanding of wind that modern homeowners rarely consider. They stored their wood on the leeward side of the house, the side shielded from the harshest storms, yet touched by steady, gentle breezes. In Norway, farmers would stack logs vertically, leaning them slightly inward so natural air channels formed between each piece. They covered only the top with bark slabs or rough planks, leaving the sides completely exposed to the wind. It was a system designed not to block the weather, but to work with it. Modern researchers have tested this technique using reconstructed Viking houses. The results are astonishing. Wood stored the medieval way against a warm wall, open to the wind drops to about 18% moisture in just 6.5 months. Meanwhile, the same wood stored in a modern, fully enclosed shed often takes more than a year and still refuses to dry properly. By letting the house itself act as a catalyst, medieval families cut their drying time in half. No electricity, no kiln, no plastic sheets, just wind, warmth, and an understanding of physics, so simple and so elegant that we almost forgot it ever existed. And in the next chapter, we'll step into a structure that looks less like a wood pile and more like a sculpture, and yet it may be one of the greatest drying machines ever invented. Part 4. The Holtzhausen. Geometry as a battery. But what happened when a medieval family had more wood than their house walls could possibly hold? When winter was long, the forests were generous, and survival demanded a stockpile that would last not months, but seasons. That's when German and Scandinavian farmers turned to one of the most ingenious pieces of firewood engineering ever created. A structure so striking that it looks like a sculpture, yet so practical that it could keep wood perfectly seasoned for years. They called it the Holtzhausen, the wood house. Imagine a freestanding cylinder of stacked logs, 3 meters high and 3 meters wide, rising like a wooden tower in the yard. Its shape wasn't chosen for beauty, although it has plenty of that. The circle served a far more important purpose: stability. As wood dries, it shrinks and shifts. A straight stack buckles outward and collapses, but a circular pile, it settles inward, tightening itself over time, becoming sturdier the older it gets. However, the true genius of the Holtzhausen wasn't its strength, it was its thermodynamics. The sun warmed the outer ring of logs, heating the air trapped inside the structure. And because the inner pieces were stacked loosely, some vertical, some angled, some irregular, the warm air could rise freely through the center. As it lifted, it created a natural suction that pulled cool, dry air in from the bottom. This constant upward flow formed what medieval farmers understood intuitively as the chimney effect, a silent engine of convection, a natural, self-regulating dryer, a giant passive thermal battery that cost nothing to operate but gave everything in return. And to finish the design, they crowned the Holtzhausen with a roof made from logs laid bark side up, creating a rustic thatched cover. Rain would bead and roll off, while the entire structure remained open enough to breathe. Even the twisted, not heavy pieces, the ones most people toss aside, were thrown into the center to improve airflow and save on splitting labor. The result was a woodpile that dried faster, stored longer, and stayed stable through storms that would destroy a modern shed. A perfect fusion of geometry, airflow, and patience. And as we move forward, this ancient mastery of materials becomes even more extraordinary, because medieval wood science didn't stop in the yard. It reached deep into the forests themselves. Part 5. The Coppice Legacy. The forest that never dies. The forgotten science of firewood didn't begin in the woodshed. It began deep in the forest itself. Long before medieval families stacked a single log against their home, they made a decision that shaped their entire future. They didn't cut forests down, they taught forests to renew themselves. For thousands of years, across Europe, families practiced an ancient method known as coppicing. Instead of felling massive old-growth trees, heavy giants that demanded days of splitting and weeks of labor, they worked with something far more intelligent: underwood. They would cut broad-leaved trees such as hazel, willow, or ash right at the base. And instead of dying, these trees responded with explosive life, sending up dozens of thin, uniform shoots. Each shoot grew fast, straight, and perfectly sized for firewood. This wasn't just forestry, it was renewable energy engineering, centuries before the term existed, because these small-diameter branches had an incredible advantage. Their high surface area to volume ratio meant they dried astonishingly fast. No splitting, no heavy axe work, just clean, even pieces of wood that could season in a single year. Medieval families bundled them tightly into what they called faggots, compact bundles of sticks that burned hot, clean, and predictably. The kind of fuel that could be relied on every winter without fail. And this wasn't a rare practice either. Studies from regions like Moravia show that nearly every lowland forest was once managed through coppicing. Entire landscapes were shaped not by chance, but by deliberate human design. Villages didn't merely harvest wood, they cultivated energy, creating forests that regenerated endlessly, producing a constant, easy-to-drive fuel supply for generation after generation. To medieval people, a coppiced woodland wasn't just a place to gather wood. It was a living battery, a renewable engine, a forest that, by design, would never die. And as we move into the next part of this journey, we'll see that once the wood was harvested and dried, medieval engineers did something even more brilliant. They turned stone itself into a reservoir of heat, capable of warming entire homes long after the fire had faded. Part 6. Thermal mass. How the stones remembered. By the time medieval families had their wood perfectly dried, seasoned by wind, warmed by walls, or cured by the elegant geometry of a Holtzhausen, they didn't simply toss it into a drafty fireplace and hope for heat. No, they paired that precious fuel with one of the most brilliant survival inventions of the old world: thermal mass. In great fortresses like Malbork Castle in Poland, engineers understood something most modern homes ignore. Air loses heat quickly, but stone remembers. And so, deep beneath the floors, they built chambers filled with tons of granite. A single fire, burning for barely 3.5 hours, was enough to heat those stones so thoroughly that they radiated warmth upward for 3 to 5 days. Imagine that. Days of steady, comfortable heat, created by just one carefully timed fire. It wasn't magic, it was engineering. This was a true thermal battery, storing heat the way modern devices store electricity. Instead of feeding a fire endlessly through the night, they heated the mass, not the air. And in doing so, they created warmth that lingered long after the flames had died. Even ordinary townhouses had their own version: the Kachelofen, or tiled stove. These massive ceramic heaters often weighed 2 tons, and inside, a labyrinth of brick channels captured every last bit of heat from the fire's exhaust. You would light it for just 90 minutes, and then for the next 24 hours, it would release a soft, radiant, heat-like sunlight captured in stone. The contrast with modern heating is almost embarrassing. A typical open fireplace today wastes most of its energy, capturing only around 15% of the heat it produces. But a medieval masonry heater, it reached up to 90% efficiency, 20 times more effective. No electricity, no fans, no automation, just physics, patience, and an unbroken chain of inherited wisdom. And as we continue, the story becomes even more striking, because this knowledge wasn't lost accidentally, it was abandoned. And what disappeared with it was not just technique, but resilience itself. Part 7. The Modern Betrayal. Why we forgot. So the question becomes unavoidable. If medieval families mastered a system so efficient, so reliable, and so brilliantly simple, why did we stop using it? Why, in the year 2025, are so many of us still battling wet wood, smoky stoves, and winter heating bills that feel like punishment? The turning point came after World War II. Across Europe and North America, electrification swept in like a miracle. Gas lines expanded, oil became cheap, and almost overnight, firewood transformed from a survival tool into a decorative accessory. Something people burned for ambience, not for life. And with that shift, the old knowledge began to fade. The techniques passed down through centuries, stacking wood against a warm wall, timing the harvest, building a perfect Holtzhausen, relying on airflow instead of plastic, slowly slipped out of memory. Skills that had once kept entire villages alive were suddenly seen as outdated, unnecessary, or simply too much work for a world chasing convenience. We didn't lose the knowledge, we abandoned it. Instead of designing homes that naturally dried their own firewood, we started buying kiln-dried logs at a premium. Instead of using high-temperature fires to keep chimneys clear, we began paying hundreds of dollars to professionals to scrape creosote out of flues clogged by wet wood we stored poorly in the first place. Little by little, industry filled the vacuum left by forgotten wisdom. And ironically, the worse we became at storing and burning wood, the more profitable it became for others to fix the problems we created. Wet wood became normal, smoky fires became expected, and resilience, the quiet, powerful self-reliance our ancestors built their lives on, was traded away for speed, simplicity, and convenience. But the truth is, the old methods didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because modern life made us believe we didn't need them anymore. Yet as energy costs soar and winters grow harsher, those forgotten techniques are no longer just historical curiosities. They are the keys to reclaiming a kind of independence we didn't realize we'd lost. And in the next chapter, we'll bring those lessons back into the modern world and show exactly how you can use medieval engineering to heat your home more efficiently, safely, and sustainably today. Part 8. Bringing the Science Home, Survival for the Future. Here is the part modern listeners never expect. You don't need a medieval longhouse, a Viking barn, or a stone castle to use any of this ancient firewood science today. In fact, the brilliance of these old techniques lies in how easily they can fit into a modern life, whether you live in a forest cabin, a suburban home, or anywhere in between. You can start with the simplest principle of all, the attached shed. Build a lean-to against the side of your house or garage. Keep the front open and the sides ventilated. Let the wall leak just a little warmth. Raise the wood off the ground, cover only the top. And then, like the medieval farmers did for centuries, let airflow, not plastic, do the work. With nothing more than wind, shade, and a slight temperature difference, your wood will season faster and cleaner than most modern storage methods ever allow. And if you have an open yard, you can take it a step further. Try building a Holtzhausen. Not only is it visually striking, like something between a sculpture and a monument, but it's also one of the most stable, efficient, and self-regulating wood-drying structures ever invented. No permanent building, no electricity, no machines, just geometry, sunlight, and the natural chimney effect. Because the medieval farmer wasn't lucky. He wasn't guessing. He was observant. He understood that nature always provides the tools for survival, if you know how to arrange them. And today, in a world of rising energy costs, harsher winters, and ever-increasing dependence on fragile modern systems, these forgotten methods return not as curiosities, but as lifelines. They remind us that resilience doesn't always come from new technology. Sometimes it's hidden in old wisdom, waiting to be revived. The past is offering us a blueprint for the future, and all we have to do is pick up the first log. Part 9. Conclusion. The flame of knowledge. In the end, the greatest survival technology isn't something delivered in a box with prime shipping. It isn't a gadget, a device, or a new invention promising effortless heat. The most powerful tool you have is knowledge. Knowledge that has weathered 8 centuries of storms, winters, and human experience. It's the understanding that stone remembers heat longer than air ever will. The insight that airflow is more valuable than any plastic cover. And the realization that a home isn't just a place to live. It is, and always has been, a thermodynamic engine capable of keeping you alive if you know how to use it. So the next time you stack your firewood, pause for a moment. Look at it with the eyes of your ancestors and ask yourself, is this a mold trap waiting to fail? Or is it a medieval heat battery quietly gathering the energy that will keep your family warm? If this journey into forgotten science helped you see the world a little differently, then make sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell. Here on Historia Prime, we resurrect long-lost knowledge every single week, because modern systems might fail, but wisdom, real wisdom, outlives everything. And now, I'd like to hear from you. Which primitive skill do you believe we should bring back in 2025? Which lost method deserves a second life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching Historia Prime. Keep the fire burning and stay warm.